When Patricia Rodriguez called me a financial drain on the family during Easter dinner, what she didn't know was that I had been anonymously covering her husband's cancer treatments for the past 3 years. The look on her face when she discovered that the mysterious benefactor keeping their family afloat was the daughter-in-law she'd been systematically trying to drive away was absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sweet scent of magnolia blossoms drifted through our bedroom window as I adjusted the pearl necklace Daniel had given me for our 5th anniversary. Charlotte's spring air carried promises of new beginnings, though I had no idea that Easter morning would mark the end of everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Daniel emerged from our walk-in closet, straightening his tie, the same nervous energy he always carried before family gatherings radiating from his movements. "You look beautiful, Em," he said, pressing a kiss to my temple as I applied the final touches of lipstick. "Mom's going to love that dress." I smiled at his reflection in our vanity mirror, knowing full well that Patricia Rodriguez had never loved anything about me, including the expensive dresses I wore to family functions. The soft lavender sundress I'd chosen was conservative enough to avoid her criticism about inappropriate attire, yet elegant enough to maintain the standards she claimed I never met. 5 years of marriage had taught me the delicate balance required to navigate the Rodriguez family dynamics, though I still hadn't mastered the art of earning their acceptance. "I'm sure she will," I replied, though we both knew it was a polite fiction we maintained to preserve the peace. Daniel and I had met during my final semester at UNC Charlotte, where I was completing my master's degree in healthcare administration, while he finished his MBA in marketing. What started as a study group partnership had evolved into something deeper, built on shared ambitions and complementary strengths. He possessed the natural charisma that opened doors, while I had the analytical mind that identified which doors were worth opening. Together, we seemed capable of conquering any challenge the business world could present. The early years of our marriage had been a whirlwind of professional success and personal happiness. Daniel secured a position with Mitchell & Associates, one of Charlotte's most prestigious marketing firms, while I launched Blue Cross Financial Solutions with my business partner, Marcus Thompson. Our company specialized in healthcare finance consulting, helping medical practices optimize their billing procedures and navigate the increasingly complex world of insurance reimbursements. What had started as a modest 2-person operation had grown into a regional powerhouse managing financial services for dozens of healthcare providers across the Carolinas. The irony wasn't lost on me that my expertise in medical billing would eventually become the tool that saved Daniel's family from financial ruin, even as they treated me like an unwelcome intruder in their tightly knit circle. But that revelation was still years away when Daniel first brought me home to meet his parents at their lake house in Cornelius. Patricia and Robert Rodriguez had built their version of the American dream through decades of hard work and careful planning. Robert had spent 30 years as a project manager for Duke Energy, while Patricia managed the administrative side of a successful dental practice. Their 3 children, Kevin, Daniel, and Amanda, had been raised with clear expectations about education, career success, and maintaining the family's reputation in Charlotte's professional community. When Daniel announced he was serious about a girl from California, whose parents were middle-class teachers rather than established Southern professionals, the reception had been politely chilly at best. "She seems nice enough," Patricia had told Daniel after our first dinner together, her tone suggesting that being nice was somehow insufficient for the Rodriguez family standards. "Though I do worry about whether she truly understands our family's values and traditions." The translation was clear. I was an outsider whose background didn't align with their expectations for Daniel's future wife. My parents' modest careers in education, my West Coast origins, and my lack of connection to Charlotte's established social networks marked me as someone who might not fit seamlessly into the life they'd envisioned for their middle son. The fact That I was building a successful business seemed less important than my inability to discuss shared acquaintances from the country club or reminisce about childhood summers at family lake houses. Over the years, I'd made countless attempts to bridge the gap between their expectations and my reality. I learned to appreciate sweet tea and SEC football, mastered the art of Southern entertaining, and even joined the junior league to demonstrate my commitment to community involvement. Each effort was acknowledged with polite appreciation, but never seemed to translate into genuine acceptance. I remained the daughter-in-law who was trying too hard, rather than the family member who belonged naturally. The turning point in our relationship dynamics had come 3 years earlier, during what should have been a routine family barbecue at the lake house. Robert had been experiencing persistent fatigue and weight loss that he'd attributed to stress from an upcoming retirement transition. Patricia had been encouraging him to see their family physician, but Robert possessed the stubborn pride common among men of his generation who viewed medical concerns as weaknesses to be endured rather than problems to be solved. When he finally collapsed during Kevin's birthday celebration, the emergency room diagnosis hit the family like a devastating blow. Stage 3 lung cancer, aggressive and requiring immediate intervention. The oncologist's treatment plan included surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy that would stretch over 18 months and cost far more than their insurance would cover. Even with Robert's excellent Duke Energy benefits, the family was looking at out-of-pocket expenses that could easily reach 6 figures. I watched Daniel's family struggle with the financial implications of Robert's illness during those first few weeks after the diagnosis. Kevin, working as a high school teacher, had minimal resources to contribute. Amanda's husband, Jason, had recently started his own construction business that was still building clientele and generating inconsistent income. Daniel and I were the most financially stable among the siblings, but even our combined resources wouldn't be sufficient to cover the massive medical bills that were beginning to arrive. The solution came to me during a sleepless night spent researching treatment options and insurance coverage limitations. Through Blue Cross Financial Solutions, I had extensive connections with medical billing companies, hospital administrators, and healthcare finance specialists throughout the region. More importantly, I understood the complex web of charity programs, payment assistance options, and third-party funding sources that most families never discovered during medical crises. Working with my business partner, Marcus, I developed a strategy that would ensure Robert received the best possible care without bankrupting the family. Using a shell company called Piedmont Healthcare Partners, LLC, we created a medical assistance fund that could anonymously cover the Rodriguez family's uncovered expenses. The beauty of the arrangement was its invisibility. Hospital billing departments would receive payments from what appeared to be a legitimate medical assistance organization, while the family would simply be told that their insurance coverage was better than initially expected. The first payment went through smoothly, covering the balance of Robert's surgical expenses that insurance had denied. When Patricia called Daniel to share the miraculous news that the hospital had found additional coverage for nearly $15,000 in previously uncovered costs, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond simple financial relief. For the first time since joining the Rodriguez family, I was able to provide something genuinely valuable, even if they would never know the source. Over the following months, as Robert's treatment intensified and the bills accumulated, Piedmont Healthcare Partners continued making strategic payments that kept the family afloat financially. Chemotherapy sessions, radiation treatments, prescription medications, and follow-up procedures were all partially or fully covered by the mysterious assistance program that seemed too good to be true. The family's gratitude for their unexpected good fortune was touching to witness, even as I remained carefully silent about my role in their financial stability. The arrangement required careful coordination with multiple healthcare providers and billing companies, but my expertise in medical finance made the logistics manageable. Marcus handled most of the direct communications with hospitals and insurance companies, while I monitored the family's ongoing needs through conversations with Daniel and strategic questions during family gatherings. It was a delicate balance that required me to stay informed about Robert's treatment progress without appearing overly interested in the financial details. The emotional complexity of the situation was more challenging than the financial mechanics. Watching Patricia express gratitude for divine intervention or good luck, while simultaneously criticizing my contributions to family gatherings, created a cognitive dissonance that was sometimes difficult to manage. During one particularly memorable Sunday dinner, she spent 20 minutes praising the mysterious benefactors who were helping with Robert's medical expenses, then transitioned seamlessly into questioning whether Daniel and I were being sufficiently supportive during the family crisis. "I just think it's important for everyone to step up during difficult times," she said, her gaze settling meaningfully on me. "Some people seem to think that being busy with work is an excuse for not being present when family needs support." The implication was clear. Despite the fact that I was literally funding her husband's cancer treatment, Patricia viewed my professional commitments as evidence of misplaced priorities. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so personally frustrating. I was working extra hours to generate the revenue that kept Piedmont Healthcare Partners solvent, but the time spent building the business that saved her family was interpreted as neglect of my family obligations. Daniel's response to these criticisms was consistently diplomatic but ineffective. He would offer gentle corrections about my contributions to family life, but he never challenged his mother's fundamental assumptions about my character or commitment. His approach was to smooth over tensions rather than address their underlying causes, a strategy that maintained short-term peace while allowing long-term resentment to build on both sides. The medical payments continued for nearly 2 years, as Robert completed his treatment and entered remission. The total amount paid by Piedmont Healthcare Partners exceeded $250,000, covering everything from surgical procedures to experimental medications that offered hope for extended survival. The Rodriguez family never questioned their extraordinary good fortune, accepting the anonymous assistance as evidence of exceptional insurance coverage and fortunate timing with charity programs. As Robert's health stabilized and the immediate medical crisis passed, I began to hope that the shared experience of facing serious illness might have softened some of the family dynamics that had always made me feel like an outsider. Surely, watching everyone pull together during a genuine emergency would create new foundations for mutual respect and appreciation. The secret nature of my contributions meant I couldn't expect direct gratitude, but I hoped the experience might make Patricia more receptive to seeing my positive qualities rather than focusing on my perceived shortcomings. Instead, the opposite seemed to occur. As the stress of Robert's illness diminished, the old patterns of criticism and exclusion returned with renewed intensity. If anything, Patricia seemed more determined than ever to establish clear boundaries about who truly belonged in the Rodriguez family and who remained an outsider despite years of marriage and genuine affection for Daniel. The fact that I had literally saved her husband's life while she questioned my commitment to family values created a level of irony that was both tragic and infuriating. The annual Easter gathering at the lake house had always been the most challenging family event for me to navigate. Unlike Christmas, which was focused on gift-giving and could be managed through careful preparation and appropriate generosity, Easter was built around tradition and shared history that predated my arrival in Daniel's life. The day began with sunrise service at the family's longtime church, followed by an elaborate brunch featuring recipes that had been passed down through generations of Rodriguez women. Every conversation seemed to reference shared memories from Daniel's childhood or family friends I had never met, creating an atmosphere where I felt perpetually like a polite guest rather than a family member. This particular Easter morning felt different from the moment we arrived at the lake house. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia's greeting was cooler than usual, her hug perfunctory rather than welcoming. Robert looked healthier than he had in years, the cancer treatment having restored much of his energy and optimism. but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't immediately identify. Amanda and Jason were already there with their 2 young children, and Kevin had arrived early to help with food preparation, creating the kind of bustling family atmosphere that usually made me feel both grateful to be included and painfully aware of my outsider status. "Emma, dear, you look lovely," Patricia said as she took my contribution to the meal, a carefully prepared fruit salad that complemented her planned menu without competing with her signature dishes. "Though I do hope you're not working too much lately. Daniel mentioned you've been putting in long hours at that little company of yours." The dismissive reference to Blue Cross Financial Solutions as my little company was typical of Patricia's subtle ways of minimizing my professional achievements. The business that Marcus and I had built now employed 12 people and generated annual revenue in the millions. But Patricia consistently described it in terms that suggested a hobby rather than a serious enterprise. The fact that this little company was funding her husband's medical expenses made her condescension particularly galling. "Business has been growing steadily," I replied, maintaining the pleasant tone that family gatherings required. "We're actually expanding into new markets this year, which is exciting, but does require additional planning and coordination." "How wonderful," Patricia responded with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for children's art projects. "I'm sure it keeps you busy." The Easter service at Morrison Presbyterian Church was a beautiful celebration of renewal and resurrection that should have filled me with hope and gratitude. The familiar hymns and traditional liturgy created a sense of continuity and community that connected past and present in meaningful ways. Robert's presence beside Patricia, healthy and engaged after his long battle with cancer, was a tangible reminder of the miracles that were possible even in the darkest circumstances. Yet I found myself struggling to concentrate on the service's spiritual message while surrounded by the family I had helped save, but who remained determined to treat me as an unwelcome addition to their circle. The cognitive dissonance between Robert's recovery and Patricia's continued coldness created an emotional tension that made it difficult to appreciate the beauty of the Easter celebration. I sat between Daniel and Amanda, participating in the responsive readings and singing along with the hymns, but feeling increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people who were supposed to be my family. The drive back to the lake house after church provided a brief respite from the social navigation required at family gatherings. Daniel and I rode in comfortable silence, both lost in our own thoughts as we watched the North Carolina countryside roll past our windows. The dogwood trees were in full bloom, creating a canopy of white and pink blossoms that transformed the familiar roads into something magical and new. Spring had always been my favorite season in Charlotte, representing possibility and fresh starts in ways that felt particularly relevant to our current family dynamics. "Mom seemed a little tense this morning," Daniel observed as we turned into the lake house driveway. "I hope everything's okay with Dad's follow-up appointments." I nodded, though I suspected Patricia's mood had less to do with medical concerns, and more to do with whatever conversation the family had been having before our arrival. The slightly forced quality of everyone's interactions suggested some kind of discussion or decision that I hadn't been included in, which was unfortunately typical of Rodriguez family communication patterns. Important conversations often occurred in my absence, with Daniel later providing edited summaries that protected me from potentially hurtful details while leaving me feeling perpetually out of the loop. The Easter brunch was an elaborate affair that showcased Patricia's considerable skills as a hostess and her deep commitment to family traditions. The dining room table was set with her grandmother's china and crystal, creating an elegant backdrop for the feast she had been preparing since dawn. Ham glazed with brown sugar and bourbon took center stage, surrounded by traditional side dishes that represented decades of refined recipes and careful preparation. Hot cross buns, deviled eggs, and an impressive array of casseroles created a menu that could have graced the pages of Southern Living magazine. I had offered multiple times over the years to contribute more substantially to these family meals, but Patricia consistently declined my offers while somehow managing to make me feel guilty for not doing more to help. The dynamic was impossible. to navigate successfully. Offering too much assistance was seen as presumptuous and overstepping, while not offering enough was interpreted as laziness or lack of commitment to family obligations. I had learned to contribute one carefully chosen dish that complemented rather than competed with Patricia's menu, while staying available to help with last-minute tasks that wouldn't threaten her role as the family's primary hostess. The conversation during brunch flowed easily among topics that had become familiar over 5 years of family gatherings. Kevin shared updates about his students and the challenges of teaching high school history in an era of budget cuts and changing educational priorities. Amanda discussed her children's activities and the logistics of managing 2 active kids, while Jason's construction business demanded increasingly long hours. Daniel talked about his latest marketing campaigns and the clients he was hoping to attract in the coming quarter. I contributed appropriately to each conversation thread, asking thoughtful questions and sharing relevant observations that demonstrated my engagement with their lives and interests. Yet there remained an underlying sense that I was performing rather than participating, playing a role rather than simply being myself. The feeling was subtle but persistent, like being a talented actor in a long-running play who could deliver all the right lines, but never quite forgot they were performing for an audience. The shift in atmosphere came without warning as we transitioned from the main course to dessert. Patricia had prepared her famous coconut cake, a towering confection that required 2 days of preparation and represented the pinnacle of her baking expertise. As she served generous slices to each family member, Kevin brought up a topic that had apparently been discussed before my arrival. "Dad, have you given any more thought to what we talked about this morning?" Kevin asked, accepting his slice of cake with obvious appreciation for his mother's culinary skills. Robert glanced at Patricia before responding, their exchange of looks suggesting a conversation that had already been carefully planned and rehearsed. "I think it's worth considering, given everything our family has been through over the past few years." The vague references to previous conversations and shared understanding created the familiar feeling of being excluded from important family discussions. I had learned not to ask directly about these mysterious consultations, as my questions were usually deflected with explanations that the topics weren't particularly important or that I would be updated if any decisions were made. The pattern had become so consistent that I had stopped trying to stay informed about family business that apparently didn't concern me. "What we've been discussing," Patricia said, setting down her fork and assuming the authoritative tone she used for important family announcements, "is the financial strain that medical expenses have placed on our family over the past few years." I felt my stomach tighten as she continued, though I couldn't yet see where the conversation was heading. The mention of financial strain seemed particularly ironic, given my knowledge of who had actually been covering the majority of Robert's medical expenses, but I maintained the interested but neutral expression that family meetings required. "Even with the insurance coverage and assistance programs that helped with Dad's treatment," Amanda added, "there were still significant costs that affected everyone's ability to contribute to family activities and shared expenses." The reference to assistance programs made my pulse quicken, though I kept my expression carefully neutral. Amanda's description was technically accurate, though she had no idea that the assistance program she was referencing had been funded entirely by the woman sitting across from her at the Easter dinner table. "What we've realized," Kevin continued, taking over the explanation with the careful timing that suggested a well-rehearsed presentation, "is that some family members have been carrying a heavier financial burden than others during this difficult time." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me, his body language suggesting he was hearing some of this information for the first time as well. The fact that he seemed as surprised as I was by the direction of the conversation provided small comfort, though it also meant he wouldn't be prepared to defend me if the discussion took a hostile turn. "The point is," Patricia said, her voice taking on the slightly sharp edge that appeared whenever she was building toward criticism, "that we need to have an honest conversation about everyone's contributions to family expenses and whether some people might be taking advantage of others' generosity." The room fell silent, except for the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock outside and the distant sounds of children playing in the yard. I could feel the weight of multiple gazes settling on me, though I couldn't yet understand what I was being accused of, or how I was supposed to respond to charges that hadn't been clearly articulated. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," I said carefully, setting down my fork and meeting Patricia's gaze directly. "What I'm suggesting," Patricia replied, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that was more intimidating than shouting, "is that while some family members have been making real sacrifices to help with Dad's medical expenses and family obligations, others seem to think they can coast along without contributing their fair share." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the Easter celebration and transforming what should have been a joyful family gathering into a tribunal where I was apparently both defendant and judge. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, his fingers squeezing mine in a gesture of support that felt inadequate given the magnitude of the attack being launched against my character and contributions. "Furthermore," Patricia continued, her confidence building as she warmed to her theme, "I think it's time we acknowledged that some people in this family have become financial burdens rather than contributors, expecting others to carry the load, while they focus on their own interests and priorities." The word burden hit me like a physical blow, particularly coming from the woman whose husband's life I had helped save through months of anonymous financial support. The irony was so complete and devastating that I found myself temporarily speechless, struggling to process the cognitive dissonance between Patricia's accusation and the reality of our financial relationship. The Easter meal that had begun with gratitude for Robert's health and hopes for family unity had transformed into something ugly and hurtful that would reshape our relationships forever. As I sat there absorbing Patricia's attack on my character and contributions, I realized that the time for silent generosity and anonymous assistance was coming to an end. The family that had benefited from my financial support while treating me as an outsider was about to learn exactly who had been carrying the real burden all along. The silence that followed Patricia's accusation stretched across the dining room like a fault line, dividing the family into those who had orchestrated this ambush and those who were witnessing it unfold. I could feel Daniel's grip on my hand, tightening, his thumb tracing nervous circles against my palm as he struggled to process what his mother had just said. The golden afternoon light streaming through the lake house windows seemed to mock the darkness that had suddenly descended over our Easter celebration. "Mom, what exactly are you trying to say?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying a warning tone that I rarely heard him use with his parents. The protective instinct in his response gave me hope that he would stand with me against whatever accusations were coming, though experience had taught me that Daniel's loyalty often wavered when family pressure intensified. "What I'm saying is perfectly clear," Patricia replied, her posture straightening as she prepared to deliver what was obviously a prepared speech. "Emma has been part of this family for 5 years, and during the most difficult period we've ever faced as a family, her contributions have been notably absent." Amanda nodded in agreement, her expression carrying the satisfied look of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for months. "We've all made sacrifices to help with Dad's medical expenses and the extra costs that came with his treatment. Some of us have been more willing to step up than others." The coordinated nature of their attack was becoming clear. This wasn't a spontaneous expression of frustration, but a carefully planned intervention designed to address what they perceived as my inadequate support during Robert's illness. The fact that they had chosen Easter dinner to stage this confrontation added an extra layer of cruelty that took my breath away. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about our financial situation," I said carefully, trying to maintain my composure while my mind raced through possible responses. "Daniel and I have always been happy to help with family expenses when needed." "Have you, though?" Kevin interjected, his teacher's voice carrying the authority he used to command classroom attention. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks Like you've been pretty focused on building your own business, while the rest of us figured out how to cover Dad's medical bills. The accusation was so fundamentally wrong that I felt dizzy trying to process it. Kevin, whose teacher's salary barely covered his own expenses, was lecturing me about financial responsibility while sitting at a table where his father's cancer treatment had been funded entirely by my anonymous contributions. The irony was so complete that I almost laughed, though I suspected that response would only escalate the confrontation. "Emma works very hard," Daniel said, finally finding his voice. "Her business has been incredibly successful, and she's never refused to help when family needs arose." "But that's just it," Patricia said, her tone becoming more aggressive as she sensed resistance to her narrative. "When exactly has she offered to help? When has Emma ever volunteered to contribute to family expenses or medical bills or any of the costs that come with maintaining family relationships?" I stared at Patricia across the table, watching her work herself into righteous indignation over my supposed selfishness, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The woman whose husband owed his life to my financial intervention was publicly humiliating me for being unsupportive. The payments I had been making through Piedmont Healthcare Partners had exceeded $250,000, but because they were anonymous, my generosity didn't exist in Patricia's version of family history. "Furthermore," Amanda added, clearly emboldened by her mother's leadership, "we've noticed that Emma seems to have plenty of money for expensive clothes and jewelry and maintaining that big house in Myers Park, but somehow there's never anything available when family needs support." The pearl necklace at my throat suddenly felt heavy, a symbol of the success that apparently marked me as selfish rather than accomplished. Amanda's observation about our house was particularly galling since the mortgage payments came from the same business income that had been funding her father's medical care. Every expensive possession she resented represented hours of work that had ultimately benefited her family more than mine. "I think we need to take a step back here," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength as he began to grasp the full scope of what was happening. "Emma has never been asked to contribute to Dad's medical expenses because we've been fortunate enough that insurance and assistance programs covered most of the costs." "Exactly." Robert spoke for the first time since the conversation had taken its hostile turn. "We've been incredibly blessed by the insurance coverage and the assistance program that helped with the bills. Most families facing cancer treatment aren't as fortunate as we've been." The mention of the assistance program that had saved their family made my stomach clench. Robert's gratitude was genuine and touching, directed toward a mysterious benefactor he would never know was sitting across from him. The disconnect between his appreciation for anonymous generosity and his family's criticism of my visible contributions created a cognitive dissonance that was almost unbearable. "But that's not the point," Patricia said, waving away Robert's attempt to moderate the discussion. "The point is that Emma has never offered to help. She's never volunteered to contribute or sacrifice or do anything that would demonstrate real commitment to this family's well-being. Because she's been too busy building her little empire," Kevin added with obvious disdain. "Making money is apparently more important than being present for family crises." The dismissive reference to my business as an empire was meant to be insulting, but it accidentally contained more truth than Kevin realized. Blue Cross Financial Solutions had indeed become something approaching a regional empire in healthcare finance, and the profits from that empire had been quietly sustaining his family through their darkest period. The fact that my success was being used as evidence of selfishness while it literally funded his father's survival created a level of irony that was almost artistic in its perfection. "I have to say," Amanda continued, her voice gaining momentum as she built on the family's collective grievances, "it's been pretty obvious that Emma considers herself above the kind of day-to-day family obligations that the rest of us take seriously." "Like what?" I asked, finally finding my voice despite the emotional whirlwind surrounding me. "Like being present," Patricia answered immediately. "Like showing up for family events without constantly checking your phone for business calls. like caring more about family relationships than profit margins and client meetings. Each accusation felt like a slap, particularly coming from people who had no idea how many client meetings I had rescheduled and how many profit opportunities I had sacrificed to maintain the financial support that kept their family stable. The business calls Patricia resented were often coordination sessions with hospital billing departments to ensure Robert's treatments continued without interruption. The profit margins she criticized were what made Piedmont Healthcare Partners possible. And frankly, Kevin said, his voice taking on the tone he probably used with particularly difficult students, we're tired of pretending that Emma's attitude toward family obligations is acceptable. The word pretending hung in the air like an accusation of fraud. They had been pretending to accept me while building a case against my character. The realization that this Easter confrontation was the culmination of years of resentment and observation made me feel nauseated. Every family gathering, every polite conversation, every attempt at building relationships had been evaluated and found wanting by people who were scoring my performance based on criteria I didn't understand. "What exactly are you asking for?" Daniel demanded, his voice now carrying real anger. "Do you want Emma to apologize for being successful? Should she feel guilty for building a business that actually helps healthcare providers serve their patients better? We want her to acknowledge that she's been a financial burden on this family rather than a contributor," Patricia said bluntly. "And we want her to either start participating in family obligations like a real family member, or stop expecting to be treated like one." The word burden hit me again with the force of a physical blow. Patricia Rodriguez, whose husband's cancer treatment had been entirely funded by my anonymous generosity, was calling me a financial burden on Easter Sunday. The woman who had never written a check for her husband's chemotherapy was lecturing me about family financial obligations. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that I felt like I was living in an alternate reality where facts had no meaning and truth was entirely subjective. "That's enough," Daniel said, standing up from the table with enough force to rattle the china. "I don't know what's gotten into all of you, but Emma doesn't deserve this kind of treatment." "Sit down, Daniel," Patricia commanded, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who expected immediate obedience. "This conversation is long overdue, and your wife needs to hear what we've all been thinking." "No, she doesn't," Daniel replied, though I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice as family pressure began to work its familiar magic. "Emma has always been supportive of this family." "Has she?" Amanda asked mockingly. "When exactly? When has Emma ever volunteered her time or money or energy for anything related to this family that didn't directly benefit her?" The question was so fundamentally unfair that I finally found my voice again. "I think there might be some confusion about what I have and haven't contributed to family expenses over the years." "Oh, really?" Patricia said, her eyebrows raising in the expression of skeptical interest she reserved for stories she didn't believe. "Please enlighten us. What exactly have you contributed?" The moment had arrived when I could reveal the truth about Piedmont Healthcare Partners and the $250,000 that had kept Robert alive and their family financially stable. I could produce the records that would prove my contributions exceeded the combined efforts of everyone else at the table. I could transform their accusation of selfishness into evidence of extraordinary generosity and watch their righteous indignation crumble into embarrassed gratitude. But something stopped me from speaking. Perhaps it was the coordinated cruelty of their attack, or the satisfaction they were taking in my humiliation, or the realization that people capable of this level of malice didn't deserve to know about my sacrifices on their behalf. Whatever the reason, I found myself choosing silence over vindication, storing their accusations away for future consideration, rather than defending myself with facts they weren't worthy to hear. "I thought so," Patricia said smugly, interpreting my silence as admission of guilt. When pressed for specifics, Emma has nothing to offer because there are no specifics. She's been coasting on Daniel's family connections while contributing nothing meaningful to family life. That's not fair, Daniel said, though his protest lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. The family dynamics that had shaped his entire life were exerting their familiar pressure, making him question his own perceptions in favor of the collective family narrative. What's not fair, Kevin said, is expecting the rest of us to carry the financial and emotional burden of family obligations while Emma focuses on building her personal wealth. Exactly, Amanda agreed. We've all made sacrifices over the past few years. Some of us have given up vacation plans to help with medical expenses. Some of us have worked extra jobs or taken on additional responsibilities. But Emma just keeps getting richer while acting like family problems are somebody else's responsibility. The accuracy of their observations about my increasing wealth made their accusations more painful, even though they had no idea that my wealth was directly connected to their family's welfare. Blue Cross Financial Solutions had indeed been extremely profitable over the past 3 years, partly because the company's expertise in medical billing had attracted new clients who trusted our ability to navigate complex healthcare finance challenges. The success that Amanda resented had made Piedmont Healthcare Partners possible. I think what we're all trying to say, Robert said gently, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontational tone but unwilling to contradict his family's united front, is that we'd like to see more evidence that Emma considers herself part of this family rather than just married to someone who happens to be part of it. Robert's softer approach was somehow more devastating than the direct attacks from Patricia and the others. His request for evidence of belonging revealed how completely I had failed to communicate my actual contributions to family welfare. The man whose life I had helped save was asking me to prove my commitment to his family's well-being. And until we see that evidence, Patricia added, I think it's reasonable to question whether Emma should continue to be included in family decisions and family gatherings where financial planning is discussed. The threat of exclusion was delivered with surgical precision, targeting my deepest fears about belonging and acceptance. Patricia understood that the prospect of being formally excluded from family events would be more painful than any direct insult. The suggestion that my inclusion in future gatherings was conditional on meeting unstated criteria for family participation was designed to make me feel powerless and desperate for approval. You can't be serious, Daniel said, though his voice suggested he was beginning to realize that they were indeed serious about restructuring family relationships to exclude me from meaningful participation. We're completely serious, Amanda replied. Emma needs to decide whether she wants to be part of this family or just married to someone who is. Those are different things, and they require different levels of commitment and contribution. The ultimatum was clear. I could either submit to their definition of appropriate family participation, which would apparently require acknowledging fault for my past behavior and agreeing to future financial contributions they deemed adequate, or I could accept exclusion from family activities and relationships. The choice was designed to be humiliating, regardless of which option I selected. This is ridiculous, Daniel said, but I could hear the defeat in his voice. 5 years of marriage had taught me to recognize the moment when Daniel's loyalty to me began to waver under family pressure. He would continue to defend me in principle while gradually accepting the family's characterization of our relationship dynamics. What's ridiculous, Patricia said, is allowing this situation to continue without addressing it honestly. Emma has been taking advantage of our family's generosity and kindness for years, and it's time that stopped. The accusation of taking advantage was particularly galling given the financial reality of our relationship, but I found myself strangely calm as I listened to Patricia's final indictment of my character and contributions. The woman who owed her husband's life to my generosity was lecturing me about taking advantage of family kindness. The irony was so complete that it transcended mere unfairness and entered the realm of cosmic absurdity. Fine, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the emotional noise with unexpected clarity. I understand your position perfectly. The sudden shift in my tone seemed to surprise everyone at the table. They had been prepared for continued protests or emotional breakdown or desperate appeals for forgiveness. My calm acceptance of their accusations was apparently not part of the script they had prepared for this confrontation. "What exactly do you understand?" Patricia asked suspiciously, as if my composure indicated some kind of trap or deception. "I understand that you believe I've been a financial burden on this family," I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I understand that you think I've failed to contribute appropriately to family expenses and obligations. And I understand that my continued inclusion in family activities is conditional on meeting standards that you'll define." Daniel looked at me with obvious confusion, clearly expecting me to fight back against the accusations or demand specific examples of my supposed failures. The fact that I was accepting their characterization without argument was apparently more unsettling than resistance would have been. "Good," Patricia said, though she sounded less satisfied than she had expected to feel at this moment of victory. "As long as we're all clear about the situation." "Oh, we're very clear," I said, standing up from the table with the same calm dignity I would use to conclude a difficult business meeting. "Thank you for making your expectations so explicit." The drive back to Charlotte was conducted in tense silence, both Daniel and I lost in our own thoughts about what had just transpired at the lake house. The dogwood blossoms that had seemed so hopeful that morning now looked fragile and temporary, a reminder that beautiful things could be destroyed by sudden storms. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar landscape and tried to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I can't believe they ambushed you like that," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence as we merged onto Interstate 77. "I had no idea they were planning to bring up financial contributions." "Didn't you?" I asked, genuinely curious about how much he had known in advance about his family's grievances against me. "Of course not," he replied, though something in his tone suggested the situation was more complicated than he was admitting. "I mean, I knew Mom had some concerns about work-life balance, but I never imagined they were keeping score of financial contributions." The reference to work-life balance concerns was telling. Daniel had apparently been having conversations with his family about my professional commitments that he hadn't shared with me. The Easter ambush might have been a surprise in its timing and intensity, but the underlying criticisms had been discussed and developed over time without my knowledge or input. "What kind of concerns about work-life balance?" I asked. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he realized he had revealed more than he intended. Just general stuff about being present for family events, nothing specific. The lie was obvious and painful. Daniel had been participating in conversations about my perceived failures as a family member, while pretending to support me during family gatherings. The betrayal felt almost as devastating as the accusations themselves, revealing a level of dishonesty in our marriage that I had never suspected. "Daniel, I need you to be honest with me," I said, turning to face him directly. "How long have you been discussing my supposed shortcomings with your family?" "It's not like that," he protested, but his voice carried the defensiveness of someone who knew they had been caught in deception. "Sometimes Mom brings up concerns, and I try to explain your perspective. That's not the same as agreeing with her criticisms." "But you don't defend me either," I observed, watching his face for confirmation of what I already suspected. The silence that followed was answer enough. Daniel had been allowing his family to build their case against me while maintaining plausible deniability about his own participation in the process. He had positioned himself as a neutral party, trying to mediate between competing perspectives, rather than as a husband defending his wife against unfair attacks. That evening, as we went through the motions of our normal Sunday routine, I found myself seeing our relationship and our life together with new clarity. The comfortable patterns that had defined our marriage suddenly felt hollow and performative, built on assumptions about loyalty and partnership that had proven to be false. Daniel's inability to defend me against his family's accusations revealed fundamental weaknesses in our relationship that I had been unconsciously accommodating for years. The irony of the situation was inescapable. While Patricia criticized me for being a financial burden on the family, I had been quietly ensuring that Robert's cancer treatment didn't bankrupt them. While Amanda resented my success and accused me of selfishness, my business income had been funding her father's survival. While Kevin lectured me about family obligations, I had been meeting obligations they didn't even know existed. The secret nature of my contributions had protected them from the knowledge of their debt to me, but it had also enabled them to construct a narrative about my character that was the opposite of reality. Their ignorance of my generosity had allowed them to perceive my success as evidence of selfishness, rather than as the foundation for their family's financial stability. As I prepared for bed that night, I made a decision that would reshape everything about our family relationships. The anonymous generosity that had characterized my approach to Robert's medical expenses was ending. The family that had called me a burden while benefiting from my financial support was about to learn exactly who had been carrying the real load all along. The game was changing, and this time I would be playing with all my cards visible on the table. Patricia Rodriguez and her children were about to discover that the daughter-in-law they had dismissed as a financial burden was actually the person who controlled their family's financial destiny. The revelation would be every bit as devastating as their Easter accusations had been. But unlike their attacks, my response would be backed by irrefutable evidence and undeniable consequences. The anonymous benefactor they gratefully acknowledged was about to become the force they would learn to fear. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that perfectly matched my emotional state as I sat in my home office reviewing the financial records that would soon transform the Rodriguez family's understanding of their recent history. The documents spread across my mahogany desk told a story of systematic generosity that had kept Robert alive and their family financially stable, even as they constructed elaborate theories about my selfishness and lack of contribution to family welfare. The Piedmont Healthcare Partners payment records were meticulously organized, chronicling every transaction from Robert's initial surgery through his final radiation treatment. $267,000 in medical expenses, covered through anonymous payments that had allowed the family to maintain their lifestyle and dignity while Robert fought for his life. Each canceled check and wire transfer confirmation represented hours of coordination with hospital billing departments, insurance companies, and medical providers who had no idea they were facilitating one of the most elaborate acts of family generosity in Charlotte's medical community. Marcus Thompson arrived at my office precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying the additional documentation I had requested over the weekend. As my business partner and the primary administrator of Piedmont Healthcare Partners, Marcus understood the financial mechanics of what we had accomplished for Robert's family, though he remained diplomatically uninformed about the personal dynamics that had motivated such extensive assistance. "Everything you requested is here," Marcus said, settling into the leather chair across from my desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had shared the building of our business empire from its modest beginnings. Hospital payment, confirmations, insurance coordination records, even the correspondence with Duke Energy's benefits department when they initially denied coverage for the experimental treatments. I reviewed the files with the clinical detachment that had made me successful in healthcare finance, though the emotional weight of each document was almost overwhelming. The denied insurance claim for Robert's targeted therapy had triggered a $20,000 payment from Piedmont Healthcare Partners. The billing dispute over his extended hospital stay had been resolved with a $35,000 anonymous contribution that prevented the family from facing collection actions. Each financial crisis had been quietly resolved before the Rodriguez family even knew it existed. "Marcus, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report documenting all Piedmont Healthcare Partners payments related to the Rodriguez family medical expenses," I said, my voice carrying the professional authority that had earned respect throughout Charlotte's business community. "Include every transaction, every communication with healthcare providers, and every instance where our intervention prevented financial hardship. Marcus raised an eyebrow at the unusual request, though years of partnership had taught him when to ask questions and when to simply execute instructions. Are we documenting this for tax purposes or legal compliance? Personal purposes, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. The Rodriguez family has raised questions about financial contributions and family obligations. I think it's time they understood the full scope of how those obligations have been met. The understanding that dawned on Marcus's face was both sympathetic and slightly horrified. As someone who had helped orchestrate the anonymous assistance program, he knew exactly how much money and effort had been invested in keeping Robert alive. The thought that the beneficiaries of such generosity were questioning my commitment to family welfare was apparently as shocking to him as it had been devastating to me. Jesus, Emma, he said quietly. They have no idea what you've done for them. None whatsoever, I confirmed. And yesterday they made it clear that they consider me a financial burden on their family rather than a contributor to family expenses. Marcus shook his head in the kind of disbelief reserved for situations where irony transcended ordinary unfairness and entered the realm of cosmic injustice. What are you planning to do with the documentation? I'm planning to educate them, I said simply. The Rodriguez family has expressed concerns about transparency in family financial matters. I think they deserve complete transparency about how those matters have been handled over the past 3 years. The remainder of Monday was spent coordinating with our accounting department to ensure that every financial record related to the Rodriguez family was properly organized and verified. The documentation process revealed details that I had forgotten during the intensity of managing Robert's treatment crisis. Emergency transportation costs when he needed to be transferred to Duke University Medical Center for specialized surgery. Prescription medications that insurance refused to cover because they were considered experimental. Even parking fees and meal vouchers for Patricia during the weeks when she practically lived at the hospital during Robert's most critical period. Every expense that might have created financial hardship for the family had been quietly assumed by Piedmont Healthcare Partners, allowing them to focus on emotional support and recovery rather than financial survival. The total investment in their family's welfare exceeded the annual income of most Charlotte professionals. Yet it had been invisible to them because anonymity had been more important to me than recognition. Tuesday brought an unexpected phone call from Daniel, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when trying to navigate between family loyalty and marital obligations. His mother had apparently spent the previous day processing the Easter confrontation and had developed additional concerns about how family relationships should be restructured moving forward. Mom wants to have a family meeting this weekend, Daniel said without preamble. She thinks we need to establish clearer expectations about family contributions and participation in major decisions. The timing was perfect for my purposes, though Daniel obviously had no idea that I was prepared to turn his mother's demand for transparency into a revelation that would devastate their carefully constructed narrative about family financial dynamics. A family meeting focused on contributions and expectations would provide the ideal forum for presenting documentation that would reframe their understanding of the past 3 years. That sounds like an excellent idea, I replied, my enthusiasm apparently surprising Daniel given the hostility of our last family encounter. I think it's important for everyone to have complete information about family financial matters before making decisions about future obligations. Emma, you don't have to prove anything to them, Daniel said, his protective instincts finally emerging now that the immediate pressure of family confrontation had passed. I know you've always been supportive of my family. The irony of his reassurance was almost painful. Daniel's belief that I had been generally supportive revealed how completely he had misunderstood the scope of my actual contributions to his family's welfare. Like his parents and siblings, he had no idea that his wife had been the anonymous force that kept his father alive and his family financially stable during their greatest crisis. I appreciate that, I said carefully. But I think your mother is right about the need for transparency in family financial matters. Everyone should understand exactly how expenses have been handled and who has been contributing what to family welfare. The conversation continued for several more minutes as Daniel tried to prepare me for what he expected would be another difficult family encounter. His warnings about his mother's determination to establish new boundaries and his siblings continued. Frustration with my perceived selfishness revealed how thoroughly the family had processed their grievances during the days since Easter. They had apparently spent considerable time refining their arguments and preparing for a confrontation that would force me to either submit to their demands or accept exclusion from family relationships. What Daniel didn't realize was that I had spent the same time period preparing documentation that would transform their planned intervention into the most devastating family meeting in Rodriguez history. The family that expected to dictate terms for my future participation was about to learn that they had been entirely dependent on my generosity for their survival. Wednesday morning brought a meeting with Sarah Williams, my attorney, to review the legal implications of revealing the Piedmont Healthcare Partners documentation to the Rodriguez family. While the Anonymous Assistance Program had been entirely legal and properly documented, I wanted to ensure that disclosure wouldn't create any unexpected complications for my business or personal interests. The payments were all legitimate charitable contributions through a properly established assistance fund, Sarah confirmed after reviewing the documentation Marcus had prepared. There are no legal issues with revealing your role in funding Robert's medical expenses. What about family law implications? I asked, already considering the possibility that my marriage might not survive the revelation of how thoroughly Daniel's family had misjudged my character and contributions. Sarah's expression suggested she was thinking along similar lines. If this leads to divorce proceedings, the documentation of your anonymous generosity would actually strengthen your position significantly. Courts tend to look favorably on spouses who make substantial financial contributions to extended family welfare. The conversation with Sarah forced me to confront the possibility that destroying the Rodriguez family's narrative about my selfishness might also destroy my marriage to Daniel. His inability to defend me during the Easter confrontation and his participation in family discussions about my supposed shortcomings had revealed fundamental problems in our relationship that might not be repairable. The man I had married seemed to lack the backbone necessary to stand against family pressure when defending me required real courage. Thursday brought an unexpected visit from Amanda, who appeared at my office in downtown Charlotte without advance notice or appointment. Her arrival was clearly designed to catch me off guard, though after years of corporate negotiations, impromptu confrontations held little terror for me. I agreed to see her immediately, curious about what additional accusations she might have developed since our Easter encounter. I wanted to talk to you privately, Amanda said as she settled into the client chair across from my desk, her gaze taking in the expensive furnishings and commanding city view that demonstrated the success she apparently resented. Away from Daniel and the family dynamics that complicate these conversations. Her tone was more conciliatory than it had been during the Easter confrontation, suggesting either genuine desire for reconciliation or strategic positioning for whatever demands she was preparing to make. I waited for her to continue, maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me well during countless difficult business negotiations. Look, I know Sunday got pretty heated, she continued, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. But I think you need to understand that we're not trying to attack you personally. We're trying to address some legitimate concerns about family dynamics. The characterization of their coordinated assault as legitimate concerns was particularly galling, though I kept my expression neutral as Amanda built toward whatever point she was trying to make. Her visit represented an opportunity to gather intelligence about the family's continued planning while maintaining the element of surprise for Saturday's family meeting. What specific concerns are those? I asked, genuinely curious about how she would frame their accusations when removed from the emotional intensity of group confrontation. Honestly, It feels like you've never really committed to being part of our family, Amanda said, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her theme. You're polite and appropriate, but there's always this sense that you're holding something back, like you're not really invested in our relationships. The observation was more perceptive than I had expected, though she had completely misinterpreted the reasons for my emotional distance. The holding back she sensed was my careful management of the secret that had defined my relationship with her family for 3 years. The investment she questioned had been literal and financial, rather than emotional and personal. Can you give me specific examples of how that lack of investment has manifested? I asked, maintaining the neutral tone that encouraged continued revelation without revealing my own position. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair, apparently unprepared for requests for specificity rather than defensive responses to general accusations. It's more about attitude than specific incidents. Like, you never seem genuinely excited about family events or really engaged with family problems. Even during Dad's illness, you seemed sort of detached from what we were all going through. The reference to my detachment during Robert's illness was particularly ironic, given that I had been more engaged with the practical aspects of his treatment than anyone else in the family. My apparent emotional distance had been the result of focusing on financial coordination and medical billing rather than the emotional processing that occupied everyone else's attention. I see, I said simply, allowing the silence to stretch until Amanda felt compelled to fill it with additional revelations. And then there's the money thing, she continued, clearly uncomfortable with the topic but determined to address it directly. We all know you and Daniel are doing well financially, but you never offer to help with family expenses or contribute to things like Dad's medical bills or family gatherings or any of the costs that come with maintaining family relationships. The money thing. Amanda's euphemistic reference to financial contributions revealed how carefully the family had been monitoring and evaluating my perceived generosity while remaining completely ignorant of my actual contributions to their welfare. Their resentment of my success was matched only by their blindness to how that success had been used to benefit them. Has anyone in the family ever asked me to contribute to medical expenses or family gatherings? I asked, maintaining my neutral tone despite the growing irony of the conversation. Well, no, Amanda admitted. But that's kind of the point. Family members shouldn't have to be asked to help. They should want to contribute because they care about the family's welfare. The circular logic of her argument was breathtaking. I was being criticized for not volunteering assistance that had never been requested for expenses that had already been covered by my anonymous contributions. The family had constructed a narrative of my selfishness based on their complete ignorance of my actual generosity. I understand, I said simply. You feel that family members should proactively offer financial assistance during difficult times. Exactly, Amanda said, clearly relieved that I seemed to be grasping her point. And not just financial assistance, but emotional support and practical help, and all the things that demonstrate real commitment to family relationships. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes as Amanda outlined the family's expectations for my future behavior and contributions. Her list of required changes included greater emotional availability during family crises, proactive offers of financial assistance, increased participation in family decision-making, and visible sacrifice of personal interests in favor of family obligations. Each requirement on her list was something I had already been providing through channels they didn't recognize or appreciate. The emotional availability she demanded had been channeled into coordinating medical care. The financial assistance she wanted had been provided through anonymous payments. The sacrifice of personal interests had occurred every time I had restructured business meetings to accommodate hospital billing coordination. The thing is, Emma, Amanda concluded, we want you to be part of this family, but being part of a family requires giving something of yourself, not just going through the motions of family relationships. Her final statement contained more truth than she realized, though she had completely misunderstood what I had been giving and how completely I had invested myself in her family's welfare. The irony of receiving lectures about family contribution from someone whose father owed his life to my anonymous generosity was almost unbearable. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain the family's perspective," I said as Amanda prepared to leave. "I think Saturday's family meeting will be very enlightening for everyone involved." The confidence in my voice apparently surprised her, though she interpreted it as agreement with her position rather than anticipation of her family's impending humiliation. Amanda left my office clearly satisfied that she had successfully communicated the family's expectations and confident that Saturday's meeting would result in either my submission to their demands or my voluntary withdrawal from family relationships. What she didn't realize was that Saturday's meeting would indeed be enlightening, but not in the way she expected. The family that had spent months building their case against my character was about to discover that the evidence of my generosity was more comprehensive and devastating than their accusations of selfishness. Friday evening brought final preparations for what would undoubtedly be the most significant family confrontation in Rodriguez history. The documentation Marcus had prepared was organized into a presentation that would systematically demolish every accusation the family had made against my character and contributions. Hospital payment records, insurance coordination files, and medical billing documentation would prove beyond any doubt that I had been the anonymous force keeping their family financially stable during their greatest crisis. Daniel spent the evening in nervous preparation for what he expected would be another difficult family meeting, where he would be forced to choose between defending me and maintaining family harmony. His anxiety about the upcoming confrontation was palpable, though he had no idea that I was prepared to eliminate the need for him to choose sides by presenting evidence that would make my position unassailable. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked as we prepared for bed. "Maybe we could just agree to contribute more visibly to family expenses going forward, without rehashing all the complaints from Easter." His suggestion that we could resolve the situation through increased future contributions revealed how completely he misunderstood both the scope of past contributions and the magnitude of his family's miscalculation. The idea that small gestures of visible generosity could compensate for $250,000 in anonymous medical expense coverage was almost laughable. "I think complete transparency is the best approach," I replied. "Your mother was right about the need for everyone to understand exactly how family financial obligations have been handled." Daniel's confusion about my confidence was understandable given his complete ignorance about Piedmont Healthcare Partners and my role in funding his father's survival. Like the rest of his family, he would learn the truth during Saturday's meeting, when documentation replaced accusations and facts overwhelmed assumptions. As I reviewed the presentation materials one final time, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness about what Saturday would bring. The revelation of my generosity would devastate the Rodriguez family's narrative about my character, but it would also end the anonymous assistance that had allowed them to maintain their dignity during Robert's illness. More importantly, it would probably end my marriage to Daniel and my connection to the family I had worked so hard to support. The Rodriguez family had demanded transparency about financial contributions and family obligations. Tomorrow they would receive more transparency than they had ever imagined possible, and the revelation would transform their understanding of the past 3 years in ways that would reshape every relationship within their family structure. The attire burden they had accused me of being was about to become the benefactor they had never known existed. Saturday morning dawned with crystalline clarity that seemed to promise revelations as sharp and unforgiving as the April sunlight streaming through our bedroom windows. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a navy blue suit that projected professional authority while remaining appropriate for what the Rodriguez family expected to be a discussion about domestic obligations. The leather portfolio containing the Piedmont Healthcare Partners documentation sat on my dresser like a weapon waiting to be deployed in the battle that would reshape every relationship in Daniel's family. Daniel moved through his morning routine with obvious reluctance, his body language betraying the anxiety he felt about returning to the lake house where I had been so thoroughly humiliated just 1 week earlier. He had spent the intervening days trying to broker some kind of compromise that would satisfy his family's demands while preserving his marriage, apparently unaware that compromise was no longer possible once trust had been so completely destroyed. "Maybe you could just acknowledge that there might be room for improvement in how we handle family obligations," he suggested, as we loaded into his car for the drive to Cornelius. "Give them something that feels like progress without admitting to specific failures." His diplomatic approach to conflict resolution had served him well in corporate marketing, but it was entirely inadequate for addressing the fundamental dishonesty that now characterized our relationship with his family. Daniel was still thinking in terms of managing perceptions rather than confronting realities, unaware that I was prepared to eliminate any possibility of continued deception. "I think honesty is the best policy," I replied, checking to ensure the portfolio was securely positioned beside me. "Your family deserves to know the complete truth about financial contributions and family obligations." The drive to Lake Norman passed in relative silence, both of us lost in contemplation of what awaited us at the Rodriguez family lake house. The scenic route that had once felt like a pleasant journey to visit extended family now carried the weight of approaching confrontation. Every familiar landmark seemed to mock the comfortable assumptions that had governed our family relationships for years. Patricia had clearly invested considerable effort in staging this family meeting to maximize psychological pressure and ensure optimal conditions for forcing my submission to their collective demands. The living room had been rearranged to create a formal seating arrangement that positioned me as the focal point of attention, while the family occupied strategic positions that reinforced their united front against my supposed selfishness. Robert looked healthier than I had seen him since before his cancer diagnosis, the successful treatment having restored both his physical strength and his natural optimism about family relationships. His presence served as a living reminder of why this confrontation was necessary, though he remained blissfully unaware that his recovery had been funded entirely by the woman his family was preparing to exile from their circle. "Emma, thank you for agreeing to this conversation," Patricia began with the formal courtesy she reserved for particularly serious family discussions. "I know last weekend was difficult for everyone, but sometimes difficult conversations are necessary for maintaining healthy family relationships." Her tone carried the authority of a woman who expected to control both the agenda and the outcome of this meeting. The careful staging and formal atmosphere were designed to emphasize my isolation, while reinforcing the family's collective power to dictate terms for my continued inclusion in their social circle. "I appreciate the opportunity to address family concerns," I replied, maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me well during countless challenging business negotiations. "I think complete transparency about family financial matters is long overdue." Amanda and Kevin exchanged glances that suggested they had prepared for this meeting with the same thoroughness their mother had applied to the physical arrangements. Their confident expressions indicated they expected this conversation to conclude with either my acceptance of blame for past failures or my voluntary withdrawal from family activities. "What we discussed last weekend," Kevin began with the measured tone he used for difficult classroom discussions, "was the pattern of minimal contribution to family expenses and obligations that we've observed over the past several years. Specifically, during Dad's illness," Amanda added, her voice carrying the emotional weight of someone who believed she was addressing legitimate grievances. "When the family needed support most, some people seemed more focused on personal priorities than family welfare." The accusation of prioritizing personal interests during Robert's illness was particularly ironic, given that my personal priorities had been entirely focused on ensuring his survival through anonymous financial support. The family crisis that they claimed had revealed my selfishness had actually demonstrated the extent of my commitment to their welfare in ways they couldn't imagine. "I think it would be helpful to be specific about expectations," I said, opening my portfolio and removing the first section of documentation. When you refer to contributions to family expenses, what specific expenses are you discussing? Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly at my request for specificity, though she appeared confident in her ability to provide concrete examples of my failures. Medical expenses that insurance didn't cover, travel costs for family members visiting the hospital, additional household expenses during Robert's treatment period, and the general financial strain that serious illness places on entire families. Each item on her list represented expenses that had been covered through Piedmont Healthcare Partners, though the family remained completely unaware of how their financial burdens had been eliminated before they even understood the scope of potential problems. Their ignorance of my actual contributions had allowed them to construct an elaborate fiction about bearing financial hardships that had never materialized. Those are certainly significant expense categories, I agreed, removing additional documentation from my portfolio. I think it would be valuable for everyone to understand exactly how those expenses were handled during Robert's treatment period. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly confused by my willingness to engage with his family's accusations rather than defending myself against their characterizations of my behavior. His bewilderment was understandable given his complete ignorance about the financial records I was preparing to reveal. Let's start with medical expenses that insurance didn't cover, I continued, placing the first set of hospital payment records on the coffee table where everyone could see them. These documents show payments made on Robert's behalf for treatments that Duke Energy's insurance plan initially denied. The family leaned forward to examine the documentation, their expressions shifting from confidence to confusion as they processed information that didn't align with their understanding of how Robert's medical expenses had been managed. The payment amounts were far larger than they had realized, and the source of the payments was completely unfamiliar. Piedmont Healthcare Partners? Patricia read aloud from the payment records, her voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty. I've never heard of this organization. They're a medical assistance fund that provides anonymous support for families facing significant healthcare expenses, I explained, maintaining the calm tone that was essential for controlling the pace of revelation. They covered approximately $60,000 in expenses that insurance denied during Robert's initial treatment phase. Robert stared at the documents with obvious shock, clearly seeing detailed records of his medical expenses for the first time. The family's gratitude for mysterious insurance coverage and assistance programs was being replaced by understanding of the actual scope of financial support they had received without knowing its source. How did you get access to these records? Amanda asked suspiciously, though her tone suggested she was beginning to grasp implications she didn't want to acknowledge. These are my records, I replied simply, removing additional documentation from my portfolio. Piedmont Healthcare Partners is my company. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of lake water against the dock and the distant sound of boats enjoying the pleasant Saturday afternoon. The Rodriguez family sat frozen in tableau, processing information that was systematically destroying their carefully constructed narrative about my character and contributions. Your company? Kevin repeated slowly, as if saying the words might make them less incomprehensible. A subsidiary of Blue Cross Financial Solutions, I confirmed, placing additional payment records on the coffee table. Established specifically to provide anonymous medical assistance for families facing financial hardship due to serious illness. Patricia's face had gone pale as she began to understand the magnitude of what she was seeing. The woman who had lectured me about family financial obligations was looking at documentation proving that I had been covering her husband's medical expenses while she criticized me for failing to contribute to family welfare. These payments, Robert said quietly, his voice barely audible as he reviewed records showing treatments that had saved his life. This is how we were able to afford the experimental therapy when insurance said it was too costly. And the extended hospital stay after complications from surgery, I added, pointing to specific payment records. And the targeted radiation therapy that required special equipment, and the prescription medications that weren't covered under the standard Formulary. Each revelation struck the family like a physical blow, as they realized that every financial crisis they thought they had somehow navigated through good fortune or exceptional insurance coverage had actually been resolved through my anonymous intervention. The mysterious assistance programs they had gratefully acknowledged were manifestations of my generosity rather than external charity. The total amount, Daniel said, his voice hollow as he processed payment records that revealed the scope of my financial commitment to his father's survival. How much did you pay? I removed the final summary document from my portfolio, a comprehensive accounting that Marcus had prepared showing every payment made through Piedmont Healthcare Partners on behalf of the Rodriguez family. The total figure was printed in bold. Type at the bottom of the page, impossible to misinterpret or minimize. $267,000, I said quietly. Over the course of 18 months. The number hung in the air like an accusation, transforming every criticism they had made about my financial contributions into evidence of their own ignorance and ingratitude. $250,000 in anonymous support while they constructed theories about my selfishness and lack of commitment to family welfare. But why didn't you tell us? Patricia asked, her voice breaking as she struggled to reconcile the documentation with her understanding of our relationship dynamics. Why keep it secret? Because I thought anonymity would preserve your dignity during a difficult time, I replied, meeting her gaze directly. I believed that allowing you to focus on Robert's recovery without worrying about financial obligations was more important than receiving credit for the assistance. The explanation revealed the fundamental miscalculation that had enabled this entire catastrophe. My desire to protect their dignity during a medical crisis had created conditions that allowed them to remain ignorant of my contributions while constructing elaborate justifications for resenting my success. Emma, Robert said, his voice thick, with emotion as he fully grasped that his survival had been funded by the woman his family had spent the morning preparing to exclude from their circle. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, I replied. I did what I thought was necessary to ensure you received the best possible care without creating financial hardship for your family. Amanda was crying silently as she reviewed payment records that documented her father's treatment with devastating precision. Each line item represented a moment when anonymous generosity had prevented financial crisis, while she remained convinced that I was failing to contribute adequately to family obligations. The assistance programs we were told about, Kevin said. Slowly, the insurance coverage that seemed too good to be true, the billing adjustments that saved us thousands of dollars in unexpected expenses. All coordinated through Piedmont Healthcare Partners, I confirmed, working with hospital billing departments, insurance companies, and medical providers to ensure that financial considerations never interfered with treatment decisions. The systematic nature of my intervention was becoming clear as they processed the scope of coordination required to manage Robert's care while maintaining complete anonymity. Every mysterious stroke of good fortune they had experienced during the medical crisis had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural while eliminating their financial burden. But the work-life balance issues, Patricia said desperately, grasping for some justification for her previous accusations. The long hours and business meetings that kept you away from family events. We're often coordination sessions with hospital administrators and insurance companies, I replied. Managing the logistics of anonymous payment required extensive communication with multiple healthcare providers during your father's treatment period. Each defense they attempted crumbled under the weight of documentation that proved my professional commitments had been directly related to their families' welfare rather than evidence of misplaced priorities. The busy schedule they had criticized was the mechanism that had kept Robert alive. The phone calls during family gatherings, Daniel said, his voice barely audible as he began to understand how completely he had misinterpreted my behavior. The meetings that seemed to take priority over family time. Medical billing emergencies don't respect social calendars, I observed. When insurance companies threatened to deny coverage for critical treatments, Immediate intervention was necessary regardless of timing. The revelation was transforming their understanding of every interaction we had shared during Robert's illness. Behavior they had interpreted as evidence of my detachment from family concerns was actually proof of my intense engagement with the practical aspects of keeping him alive. "I need some air," Amanda said suddenly, standing up from the couch with obvious distress. "This is too much to process." She stepped onto the deck overlooking Lake Norman, leaving the rest of us to sit in the wreckage of assumptions that had governed our family relationships for years. The comfortable narrative about my selfishness had been replaced by evidence of generosity so extensive that it redefined our entire dynamic. "Emma," Patricia said finally, her voice carrying the weight of recognition that her accusations had been not just wrong but cruelly ironic. "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to begin." "You owe me honesty about why you were so determined to believe the worst about my character," I replied, my tone remaining calm despite the emotional intensity of the moment. "Even when evidence contradicted your assumptions." The question forced Patricia to confront the psychological mechanisms that had enabled her to maintain negative opinions about me, despite years of polite behavior and professional success. Her need to see me as an outsider who didn't deserve inclusion in their family circle had overwhelmed her ability to assess my actual contributions objectively. "I think," she said slowly, "I was threatened by your success and independence. It was easier to find fault with your commitment to family than to acknowledge that you were more capable than I wanted to admit." The admission was more honest than I had expected, revealing insecurities that had motivated years of criticism and exclusion. Patricia's determination to diminish my contributions had been psychological self-protection rather than legitimate concern about family welfare. "And I went along with it," Daniel said, his voice carrying the shame of recognition about his own failures during this crisis. "I let them criticize you without defending what you were actually doing for our family." His acknowledgement of complicity was necessary but insufficient, given the scope of betrayal his silence had enabled. Daniel's unwillingness to challenge his family's assumptions about me had created conditions where their ignorance could flourish into active hostility. "The question now," I said, gathering the documentation that had transformed this family meeting from intervention to revelation, "is how we move forward with complete honesty about our relationships and expectations." The challenge facing the Rodriguez family was fundamental. They had to decide whether they could rebuild family dynamics based on accurate understanding of contributions and character, or whether the damage done by years of false assumptions was irreparable. Robert was still reviewing payment records, apparently struggling to fully comprehend that his survival had been purchased by someone his family had been systematically excluding from meaningful participation in family decisions. The cognitive dissonance between their treatment of me and my treatment of them was almost impossible to reconcile. "Can you forgive us?" he asked quietly, looking up from the documents that proved his debt to me was both financial and existential. "I can forgive the ignorance," I replied carefully. "But I'm not sure I can forgive the deliberate cruelty of using Easter dinner to publicly humiliate someone who had been quietly ensuring your family's survival." The distinction was important. Their lack of knowledge about my contributions was understandable, but their choice to coordinate a public attack on my character revealed meanness that knowledge alone couldn't excuse. "What do you want from us?" Kevin asked, his teacher's practical nature seeking concrete steps toward resolution. "I want acknowledgement that your assumptions about my character were wrong," I said. "I want recognition that success and generosity aren't mutually exclusive, and I want assurance that family relationships will be based on truth rather than convenient fictions." The demands were reasonable but challenging given the extent to which their family dynamics had been built on misunderstanding my role and contributions. Rebuilding trust would require more than apologies. It would need fundamental changes in how they processed information about family members and contributions. "And Daniel," I continued, turning to face my husband directly. "I want to understand why you were willing to participate in conversations about my supposed failures without ever defending my actual character." The question that had haunted me since Easter was finally being addressed directly. Daniel's betrayal wasn't just his failure to support me during family attacks. It was his willingness to contribute to the construction of false narratives about my priorities and commitments. "I was afraid of confronting them," he admitted, his honesty both painful and necessary. "It was easier to let them vent their frustrations than to challenge assumptions that might create permanent family conflict." His cowardice had enabled the very conflict he was trying to avoid, allowing small misunderstandings to grow into elaborate theories about my selfishness. The peace he had tried to preserve through silence had ultimately made this confrontation inevitable and more devastating. The family meeting that had been designed to force my submission to their demands had instead revealed the extent of their debt to me and the falseness of their accusations. The burden they had accused me of being was actually the benefactor who had saved their family from financial and medical catastrophe. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Lake Norman, the Rodriguez family faced the challenge of rebuilding relationships based on truth rather than assumption. The documentation spread across their coffee table proved that generosity and success weren't mutually exclusive, but it would take time to determine whether damaged trust could be repaired, or whether some revelations create wounds that never fully heal. The silence that followed my revelation stretched across the lake house living room like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of truth that had just shattered every assumption the Rodriguez family had held about my character for the past 5 years. Patricia sat frozen in her chair, staring at the payment records that proved her husband's survival had been purchased by the woman she had just finished calling a financial burden. The color had drained from her face as she processed the magnitude of her miscalculation. Robert's hands trembled as he reviewed document after document showing treatments that had saved his life, each payment record representing intervention that had occurred while his family criticized me for failing to contribute adequately to family welfare. The experimental therapy that had eliminated his cancer, the extended hospital stays that had prevented complications, the medications that had managed his recovery had all been funded through my anonymous generosity, while they constructed elaborate theories about my selfishness. $267,000, Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible as she processed the total amount I had spent ensuring her father's survival. Over 18 months. The number hung in the air like an accusation, transforming every criticism they had made about my character into evidence of their own ignorance and cruelty. Kevin's confident assertions about my lack of family commitment crumbled under the weight of documentation that proved I had been more committed to their family's welfare than any of them had imagined. "But why didn't you tell us?" Patricia asked, her voice breaking as she struggled to reconcile the documentation with her understanding of our relationship. "Why keep something this significant secret?" "Because I believed that preserving your dignity during a medical crisis was more important than receiving credit for assistance," I replied, maintaining the calm tone that was essential for managing this confrontation. "I thought anonymity would allow you to focus on Robert's recovery without the burden of financial obligation." The explanation revealed the fundamental miscalculation that had enabled this catastrophe. My desire to protect their dignity had created conditions that allowed them to remain ignorant of my contributions while constructing elaborate justifications for resenting my success and excluding me from meaningful family participation. "The assistance programs we were told about," Kevin said slowly, his teacher's analytical mind finally connecting the pieces. "The insurance adjustments that seemed too good to be true. The billing corrections that saved us thousands of dollars. All coordinated through Piedmont Healthcare Partners," I confirmed, watching his face as he began to understand how completely his assessment of my character had been wrong. Working with hospital administrators, insurance companies, and medical providers to ensure that financial considerations never interfered with treatment decisions. Daniel sat beside me in stunned silence, processing the revelation that his wife had been funding his father's survival while his family planned her exclusion from family activities. His hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently in, a gesture that felt inadequate given the scope of betrayal that had just been exposed. "Emma," Robert said quietly, his voice thick with emotion as he fully grasped that his life had been saved by someone his family had spent the morning preparing to exile. "I don't know how to begin thanking you." "You don't need to thank me," I replied. "I did what I believed was necessary to ensure you received optimal medical care without creating financial hardship for your family." Amanda was crying silently as she reviewed payment records that documented her father's treatment, with devastating precision. Each line item represented a moment when anonymous generosity had prevented financial crisis, while she remained convinced that I was failing to contribute adequately to family obligations. "The work-life balance issues we criticized," Patricia said desperately, grasping for some justification for her previous accusations. "The business meetings that seemed to take priority over family events were often coordination sessions with hospital billing departments," I replied. "Managing anonymous payments required extensive communication with healthcare providers during your father's treatment period. The revelation was systematically destroying every criticism they had made about my priorities and character. Behavior they had interpreted as evidence of my detachment from family concerns was actually proof of intense engagement with the practical aspects of keeping Robert alive." "I need some air," Amanda said suddenly, standing up and walking onto the deck overlooking Lake Norman. The rest of us sat in the wreckage of assumptions that had governed our family relationships for years. "Emma," Patricia said finally, her voice carrying the weight of recognition that her accusations had been not just wrong but cruelly ironic. "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to begin. You owe me honesty about why you were so determined to believe the worst about my character," I replied, meeting her gaze directly, even when evidence should have suggested otherwise. The question forced Patricia to confront the psychological mechanisms that had enabled her to maintain negative opinions about me despite years of professional success and polite behavior. Her need to see me as an outsider who didn't belong in their family had overwhelmed her ability to assess my actual contributions objectively. "I think I was threatened by your success," she admitted slowly. "It was easier to find fault with your commitment than to acknowledge that you were more accomplished than I wanted to admit." Her confession revealed insecurities that had motivated years of criticism and exclusion. Patricia's determination to diminish my contributions had been psychological self-protection rather than legitimate concern about family welfare. "And I failed to defend you," Daniel said, his voice carrying shame about his complicity in enabling the family's attacks on my character. "I let them criticize you without challenging assumptions I should have questioned." His acknowledgement was necessary but insufficient given the scope of betrayal his silence had enabled. Daniel's unwillingness to confront his family's hostility had created conditions where their ignorance could flourish into active cruelty. Robert was still examining payment records, apparently struggling to comprehend that his survival had been purchased by someone his family had been systematically excluding from important decisions. The cognitive dissonance between their treatment of me and my treatment of them was almost impossible to reconcile. "Can you forgive us?" he asked quietly, looking up from documents that proved his debt to me was both financial and existential. "I can forgive ignorance," I replied carefully, "but I'm not sure I can forgive the deliberate cruelty of using Easter dinner to publicly humiliate someone who had been quietly ensuring your family's survival." The distinction was important. Their lack of knowledge about my contributions was understandable, but their choice to coordinate a public attack on my character revealed meanness that knowledge alone couldn't excuse. The afternoon stretched into evening as we processed the implications of revelations that had fundamentally altered every relationship in the room. The family that had gathered to force my submission to their demands had instead discovered the extent of their debt to me and the falseness of their accusations. What happens now? Kevin asked, his practical nature seeking concrete steps toward resolution despite the emotional complexity of what had been revealed. Now we decide whether family relationships can be rebuilt based on truth rather than convenient assumptions, I said, gathering the documentation that had transformed this intervention into revelation. Whether acknowledgement of past failures can create foundation for different kinds of interactions. The challenge facing the Rodriguez family was fundamental. They had to determine whether they could rebuild dynamics based on accurate understanding of contributions and character, or whether damage done by years of false assumptions was irreparable. Amanda returned from the deck with red eyes but composed demeanor, having used the time alone to process the full scope of what she had learned about my anonymous generosity and her family's systematic misjudgment of my character. "I keep thinking about every criticism we made," she said, settling back into her chair with obvious difficulty. "Every accusation about your priorities and every assumption about your selfishness. All of it was wrong." Her recognition of how completely their narrative had been contradicted by reality was both appropriate and painful. The family's elaborate theories about my character had been exposed as projections of their own insecurities rather than accurate assessments based on evidence. "The question is whether we can learn from being so completely wrong," I replied. "Whether this experience teaches us to base judgments on evidence rather than assumptions." The conversation continued as shadows lengthened across Lake Norman, with each family member struggling to process not just the factual revelation about my contributions, but the psychological mechanisms that had enabled such systematic misjudgment of someone they had known for years. "I think about all the family meetings where we discussed your supposed failures," Patricia said, her voice hollow with recognition of how their planning sessions had been taking place in a house where Robert was alive because of my financial support. "We were literally meeting to exclude you while you were ensuring our survival." The irony was indeed complete. The family gatherings where they had criticized my character had been made possible by the generosity they claimed I lacked. The health that allowed Robert to participate in condemning my contributions was direct result of medical care I had funded anonymously. "We don't deserve your forgiveness," Kevin said bluntly, his educator's honesty compelling him to acknowledge the magnitude of their failures without seeking to minimize consequences through appeals for mercy. "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve," I replied. "It's about what I choose to do with the truth we now all understand." The drive back to Charlotte passed in heavy silence as Daniel and I processed what had occurred at the lake house. The confrontation that was supposed to force my acceptance of blame for family failures had instead revealed the scope of my anonymous generosity and the cruelty of their accusations. "I can't believe I let them attack you like that," Daniel said finally, his voice carrying the weight of recognition about his own failures during the family crisis. "Knowing your character the way I do, I should have defended you regardless of what they claimed." His regret was genuine, but came too late to prevent the damage that had been done to our marriage by his willingness to sacrifice spousal loyalty for family harmony. The man I had loved and trusted had proven unreliable when circumstances required him to choose between competing loyalties. "The problem wasn't just that you failed to defend me," I pointed out. "The problem was that you participated in conversations about my supposed shortcomings without ever challenging their assumptions." Daniel's tendency to avoid confrontation had served him well in professional contexts, but it was entirely inadequate for marriage when family pressure threatened to overwhelm honest communication. His diplomatic approach had enabled rather than resolved the conflicts that were destroying our relationship. The weeks following the revelation passed in strange suspension of normal family dynamics, as if everyone was holding their breath while waiting to see whether relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than assumption. The documentation I had presented had shattered their narrative so completely that they seemed unsure how to interact with me without the comfortable framework of criticism that had defined our relationships. Patricia's first attempt at reconciliation came through a handwritten letter delivered 3 days after the family meeting. The elegant stationery reflected her attention to detail, though the words revealed vulnerability I had never seen from her before. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "I have spent 72 hours trying to find words adequate to express my shame about how badly I misjudged your character. The documentation you shared has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own motivations." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Patricia's growing awareness of how her insecurities about my success had motivated years of subtle undermining. She acknowledged that her resistance to accepting me as Daniel's wife had nothing to do with my worthiness and everything to do with her own psychological barriers. "I realize now that my criticism of your contributions had nothing to do with your actual behavior," she wrote. "I was threatened by your accomplishments and afraid that your success somehow diminished the importance of the life Robert and I had built together." Her honesty about the psychological mechanisms behind years of hostility was impressive, though it couldn't erase damage caused by systematic exclusion based on willful misunderstanding. Patricia's admission that she had been threatened by my success explained much about family dynamics that had made me feel perpetually unwelcome. "The revelation that you funded Robert's medical care while I criticized you for failing to support our family represents irony that I find almost unbearable," the letter continued. "You demonstrated generosity that exceeded anything I could have imagined, while I constructed theories about your selfishness." Amanda's approach to reconciliation was characteristically direct, appearing at my office without appointment to address what she had learned about my contributions to her father's survival. "I can't stop thinking about our conversation in this office," she said as she settled into the client chair. "I sat right here and lectured you about family contributions while you had already contributed more to my father's survival than the rest of us combined." Her voice carried genuine remorse mixed with bewilderment about how completely she had misread our family dynamics. Amanda's criticism of my priorities had been delivered with such conviction that she was now struggling to understand how her perceptions could have been so fundamentally wrong. "When you missed Kevin's birthday because of work emergencies," she continued, "we talked about how you didn't prioritize family events. Now I realize you were probably coordinating some aspect of Dad's medical care." The specific example was accurate. Kevin's birthday had conflicted with insurance authorization crisis for Robert's experimental therapy, requiring immediate intervention to prevent treatment delays that could have been life-threatening. My choice to prioritize medical coordination over social obligations had been interpreted as evidence of misplaced values. "I feel sick about the things we said to you," Amanda admitted. "The accusations about your character were not just wrong but cruel, especially considering what you were actually doing for us." Kevin's response was complicated by his professional identity as an educator who prided himself on analytical thinking and evidence-based conclusions. The discovery that he had participated in condemning someone whose generosity had saved his father's life was devastating to his self-image as fair and rational. "I teach students about examining evidence before drawing conclusions," he said, during a painful phone conversation. "But when it came to evaluating your contributions to our family, I let emotion override objective analysis." His professional embarrassment about failing to apply his own educational principles was matched by personal shame about the cruelty of accusations that had been based on complete ignorance of relevant facts. Robert's processing of the revelations was most complex, given that the medical expenses I had covered were directly related to his survival. The man who had expressed gratitude for mysterious assistance programs was now confronting reality that his anonymous benefactor was the daughter-in-law his family had been excluding. "Every day I'm alive represents generosity I never knew existed," he said during a private conversation. "When doctors told me about treatment options that insurance wouldn't cover, I prepared to choose between bankruptcy and death. The discovery that those treatments were somehow affordable felt miraculous." His description revealed how completely the family had been protected from understanding the true scope of potential financial devastation. The choices he had been prepared to make between financial and physical survival had been eliminated through my intervention. But the most painful part, he continued, is realizing that while you were saving my life, my family was criticizing you for not caring about family welfare. The irony wasn't lost on Robert that the person ensuring his survival was simultaneously being accused of failing to support family members during crisis. His awareness of this disconnect created cognitive dissonance that was almost unbearable. "How do I express gratitude for something this significant?" he asked. "How do I acknowledge that my survival was purchased by someone my family was determined to see as selfish?" The question revealed Robert's struggle with inadequacy of normal expressions of appreciation given the scope of what had been done for him. Conventional thanks seemed meaningless when applied to interventions that had made the difference between life and death. Daniel's struggle to rebuild trust in our marriage proved more challenging than his family's efforts to repair relationships with me. While Patricia and others could frame their behavior as misguided assumptions corrected by new information, Daniel's failures were more personal and fundamental to our partnership. "I keep trying to understand what I was thinking during those conversations with my family," he said during evening walks through our neighborhood. "How could I participate in discussions about your supposed failures without defending what I knew to be your actual character?" His confusion was genuine, but inadequate, given the clarity of what had occurred. Daniel had allowed family pressure to override personal knowledge of my character, choosing temporary peace over marital loyalty when the two came into conflict. "You weren't confused about my character," I pointed out. "You were conflict-averse and chose the path of least resistance rather than defending your wife against false accusations." The assessment was harsh, but accurate. Daniel's failure hadn't been ignorance about my contributions, since he had been unaware of the medical assistance program. His failure had been willingness to allow family criticism without challenging assumptions or defending my character. 6 months after the revelation, family relationships had stabilized into patterns that acknowledged my contributions while carrying weight of previous betrayals. Patricia's efforts to rebuild our relationship were genuine and consistent, though they couldn't erase memory of years spent feeling unwelcome. "I hope you know how much we appreciate everything you've done for our family," she said during a summer gathering at the lake house, her voice carrying sincerity of someone who had learned to value what she had previously dismissed. The acknowledgement was appropriate, though it highlighted sad irony that recognition of my generosity had required dramatic revelation rather than growing naturally from observation of my character over time. The family that now praised my contributions had spent years criticizing my priorities while benefiting from assistance they never knew existed. Robert's health continued improving throughout the year, with follow-up appointments confirming that his cancer remained in remission and his prognosis was excellent. The medical crisis that had triggered my anonymous intervention was definitively resolved, though financial and emotional consequences continued influencing family relationships. "Dr. Martinez says I'm ahead of schedule for recovery milestones," Robert reported during family dinner, his relief and gratitude creating emotional atmosphere that highlighted the stakes of the medical crisis we had navigated. The success of his treatment was gratifying on multiple levels, representing both victory of medical intervention over serious illness and validation of my decision to ensure that financial considerations didn't interfere with optimal care. Amanda's relationship with me underwent dramatic transformation, evolving from open hostility to genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences as working mothers navigating professional obligations alongside family responsibilities. "I've been thinking about our conversation in your office," she said during a shopping trip that would have been unimaginable during the period when she was leading family criticism of my character. "About how I misinterpreted your professional commitments as evidence of misplaced priorities." Her willingness to revisit previous assumptions was part of ongoing process of rebuilding trust that required confronting specific examples of previous hostility. The shopping trip itself represented voluntary social interaction that hadn't existed during years when relationships were strained. I realize now that I was probably jealous of your success, she continued, demonstrating honest self-reflection necessary for establishing different dynamics. It was easier to criticize your priorities than acknowledge that you were managing responsibilities more effectively than I was. By the first anniversary of the Easter confrontation, family relationships had evolved into sustainable patterns based on mutual respect rather than assumptions and prejudices. The annual Rodriguez vacation to Kiowa Island provided a test of whether improved dynamics could survive extended time together. This feels different from previous family trips, Daniel observed as we walked along the beach after dinner where conversation had flowed naturally and included my perspectives without subtle exclusion that had characterized previous gatherings. The difference was significant, representing cumulative effect of months spent rebuilding relationships based on accurate understanding rather than convenient fictions. The vacation that would previously have been endurance test had become genuinely enjoyable celebration of improved relationships. Patricia's request for business advice about retirement planning represented complete reversal from her previous dismissal of my professional expertise. The woman who had criticized my focus on career success was now seeking to benefit from knowledge that success represented. The Kiowa vacation concluded with family dinner, where Robert raised toast to relationships and supporting each other through difficult times. His words were carefully chosen to acknowledge lessons learned without creating discomfort through overly specific references. To family members who demonstrate their love through actions rather than just words, he said, his gaze meeting mine, directly in acknowledgement of my contributions. And to the importance of seeing people clearly rather than through the lens of our own assumptions, Patricia added, reflecting her journey toward understanding how insecurities had motivated years of unfair criticism. As we returned to normal routines in Charlotte, the question of whether our marriage could survive revelations about Daniel's failure to defend me remained unresolved. While relationships with his family had been rebuilt, fundamental issues about trust continued undermining confidence in our partnership. I think we should consider marriage counseling, Daniel suggested during ongoing conversations about our relationship's future. Professional help might give us tools for addressing trust issues that my failures created. His willingness to acknowledge need for professional intervention represented progress in understanding scope of damage his diplomatic approach had caused. The betrayal of marital loyalty wasn't something that could be resolved through improved family dynamics alone. 2 years after the Easter revelation, the Rodriguez family had transformed from critics to supporters of my character and contributions, though the journey had highlighted how much unnecessary pain could be caused by willful determination to maintain false assumptions despite contradictory evidence. The family that had called me a burden while benefiting from my anonymous support had learned to value contributions they had previously dismissed, demonstrating that even damaged relationships could be rebuilt when people chose truth over convenient assumptions. However, the scars from years of systematic misjudgment served as permanent reminders of how completely wrong intelligent people could be when psychological barriers prevented accurate assessment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.